Chair Gui, we are live.
Thank you. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Could I call for a roll call? Secretary Helene?
Thank you. Chair Gui.
Present.
Regent Balducci. Here. Regent Bloom. Regent Bloom is with us virtually.
Yep.
Student Regent Earlington.
Yep.
Is expected. Regent James.
Present.
Regent Jappanen.
Present.
Regent Porth. Here. Student Regent Sanchez. His absence is noted, but he is expected. Regent Santiago. His absence is noted, but he is expected. I'm going to note that Regent Sanchez and Regent Santiago just joined us. Regent Stewart.
Here.
Regent Wright.
Here.
Regent Yang. Our ex officios, Professor Cunningham.
Here.
Professor Susanker.
I'm here, and I'll be there in person.
Thank you. Commissioner Bartolomeo. Absence is noted. Commissioner Giuttani. Absence is noted. Commissioner O'Keefe. Absence is noted. Commissioner Russell Tucker. Absence is noted. Chief Workforce Officer Valeries. Undersecretary Charlene Casamento. Present. And our presidents, President John Maduco. He is expected. Interim President Smith.
Present.
President Toro. Here. Interim President Singh. Here. President Klonowski. Absence is noted. And President Ismaili. Absence is noted.
Present.
Oh, there he is. Thank you. I'll make that correction. President Ismaili has noted he is present. And Chair Gui, we have a quorum.
Thank you. We're here today to review the MCHEMS report that will be presented. I would like to say generally there's no invitation for public comment at a special meeting of the Board of Regents, which today is a special meeting. However, questions and comments regarding the MCHEMS study will be welcome following questions from regents and institution presidents, time permitting, based upon the schedule of our MCHEMS presenter. I will say that we've received a long document from AAUP, Louise Williams. Thank you. I've read that, and it was very comprehensive. As everyone knows, OPM commissioned this study. I'm going to turn it over to ex officio Charlene Casamento, but this study will allow us to understand our program, our structure better, our comparison to our peers in the higher education setting, recommendations on go forward with considerations in short and long-term operational support needed for long-term sustainability. As a point of privilege, I'd like to turn it over to the Chancellor for a few comments before we turn it over to you, Charlene. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here in person and online. I think the season is on us, so I declare this winter also. Chancellor.
Thank you, Chair Gui. Thanks again to everyone for being here this morning, in person and remote. I'll have more full remarks at our next board meeting later this month. For now, just let me say that we really appreciate the work of the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems. You'll hear their acronym a lot, NCHEMS, today. But they put a lot into producing this report. We look forward to hearing the presentation and reviewing their recommendations. We're going to take advantage of any asset that will help us improve CSCU with the goal of helping our students and improving their experience. One of the best investments Connecticut can make is the continued funding of our colleges and universities. CSCU students are from Connecticut, and after they graduate, they stay in Connecticut to live, work, and raise their families. There is no more powerful or impactful force for the continued well-being of our state, and we are proud to work with and on behalf of our faculty and our staff and our students. Thank you, Chair Gray.
Thank you. Thank you, Chancellor Cheng. Charlene?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to provide an overview of the NCHEMS report. Before we get started, I first want to thank everyone that contributed to the report. Chancellor Chang, Chair Gui, faculty, staff, system office, and presidents across the system. As part of the 24-25 biennial budget, the legislature provided OPM with funding to contract with a higher education expert to conduct an independent third-party study of CSU. The NCHEMS report is intended to position CSU to meet student demand, to become more fiscally stable and efficient while improving student outcomes and meeting the workforce needs of Connecticut's economy. The NCHEMS report has a lot of information. It will take time for each of us to digest, to hear from stakeholders, to evaluate which of the recommendations and on what scale and timeline are in the interest of CSU, as well as the state, to proceed with implementation. It is our hope that the NCHEMS recommendations will become a resource for CSU, as well as the state, to strengthen higher education in Connecticut. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Brian Prescott, president of NCHEMS, to provide an overview of the report. However, I do want to note that Brian will be here until about 11:30 to respond to any questions you may have, and I certainly can remain after to hear additional feedback from stakeholders to the extent that there continues to be other comments that people want to share. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Undersecretary Casamento. It's my pleasure to come to you after working on this project for about a year to sort of provide an overview of what has grown into a very long report. And so certainly I won't be able to touch on everything that's in it. And there's a lot of nuance, I hope, that you find in the reading of it. But I want to get through the main parts in as relatively little time as possible. So just as a little bit of background about NCHEMS, we are a nonprofit organization that is located in Boulder, Colorado. Our mission is to use data and evidence to drive strategic decision making for systems, state agencies, institutions, and legislators around post-secondary education. And we've been pursuing that mission for 55 years now. Our work has touched at some point every state in the country in various different ways. We've worked increasingly on challenges very much alike, like the ones that CSU is facing in states like Vermont, Wisconsin, Oregon, and a whole host of others just in the recent past. And it's been our pleasure to work on this project as well. We are advocates for higher education and the benefits that it brings to states and to students. We are also especially advocates for public comprehensive four-year institutions and community colleges that serve the populations, that tend to serve the populations that are most in need of higher education services. And so as we go into that, I wanted to make that statement, and you can judge to the degree to which you believe that that's true, but it certainly is the way in which we approach our work. The purpose of our study, as Charlene mentioned, is to address sort of not just the significant multi-year declines in enrollment that the CSCU institutions have faced in the last decade or so, but also looking forward to some of the demographic challenges that are likely to continue to hit Connecticut and other states in the country, but particularly in New England. Our job is to try to figure out a way and to put forward some strategies for the system to adopt to become more financially sustainable in light of those challenges and to effectively meet state and students' needs. Along the way, you will hear recommendations that we direct also at the state, not just CSCU. This was not directly in the scope of our work. But we understand that the policy environment that the state sets up can create the right kind of conditions for institutions like CSCUs to thrive or to be sort of swimming against the current. And so we've made some attempt to try to address those issues as well. But our tasks, as you see here, were around writing an evaluation of the organizational structure of CSCU, comparing CSCU and its institutions to peers, making recommendations of solutions to scale and restructure CSCU to address the challenges of projected enrollment demand and to improve outcomes for students and to satisfy the changing workforce needs of the state, and to create some ideas for strong short and long-term financial plans. Our approach was, as has been the case throughout our entire history, to do a pretty deep dive into the data that we were able to gather from publicly available sources, typically iPads and the Census Bureau, but also state-specific data from Connecticut and CSCU data that we requested from the system office, and mostly was provided, well, it was all provided by the system office, and some of it was gathered from the institutions as well. Those data were for enrollments and financials, as well as organizational structures and some data on facilities. Part of our scope was to do an analysis of the footprint, the physical footprint of the CSCU institutions, and that is not a capacity that we have in great quantity, so we subcontracted that portion of our work to a space planning and architecture firm that did some analysis on the facility space as well. We did also build peers for the system as well as for the institutions, and ran some analyses for that. You will see a lot of those analyses in the appendix of the report, which actually consumes a large chunk of the total page numbers of the report. I should mention at this point too that I think the intent is to make this slide deck available. It includes some slides that I don't intend to go over in my overview presentation, but there are some specific ones that are pulled from the appendix of our report, as well as some that are created to sort of really illustrate the choices and trade-offs associated with some of the options for structure that we have produced for this report. We also, in order to get data on the system office, which does not report its information to iPads like other system offices have done, we partnered with the National Association of Higher Education Systems. We were already planning to do this, and in order to better understand the role and function of systems as they are evolving in a changing and challenging climate, we gathered data from systems across the country through the membership of NASH, and use some of that data in the report as well. I'm going to cover the stakeholder engagement activities we were involved in, and then of course we did drafting and review of our reports throughout the process, including passing those reports off to the system office for review. When we do work like this, we think it's really important to engage with stakeholders in a significant way, and so we visited with Connecticut's institutions and its leadership 3 times during the course of this work in person. In January of 2024, we made an initial trip and met with CSC leadership, OPM, the governor's office, and the presidents. In April 2024, we came out again and visited all the campuses, as well as state offices. At that time, our intent was to gather information about the type of challenges and some of the responses that institutions were engaging in around the problems that they were perceiving. And so we met with, at that time, the presidents and their cabinets of the institutions. We met with faculty and staff. We met with students, and we had the campuses invite local and regional employers and civic leaders that we met with as well. And then finally in September, we made a final visit Again, we traveled to each of the campuses where we met with institutional leadership. This trip was largely to sort of float ideas about the recommendations that were to come forward and gather feedback on them. We also met again with state offices, and we met with faculty senate leaders and union leaders in a combination in-person and virtual meeting during that visit as well. Throughout the entire work, we had regular communication with OPM and with CSCU system office leadership, and occasionally with institutions. We had 2 meetings with Chair Gay, and we also had a meeting with the Faculty Advisory Council co-chairs early in the process, and we were asked to do a presentation before the Higher Education Financial Sustainability Advisory Board, largely not about CSCU, but about the conditions facing higher education institutions nationally. We felt it was important to sort of lay out some of the contextual factors that are impacting higher education nationally and in Connecticut, sort of to put Connecticut's situation in a broader relief. And so the first point here to be made is that enrollment declines are not happening just in Connecticut. They are a national issue, and they are happening in the public comprehensive and 2-year sector more so than in other sectors of higher education, just like is the case in this state. These changes are due to a number of factors. We recognize the counter-cyclical nature of enrollments, particularly in community colleges, so that when the economy is robust, students face higher opportunity costs to go to college. And so those that are on the margin of choosing whether to attend or to go to work are more likely to go to work when there's options to go to work. And so there are some conditions in the economic that have been in place for a number of years that I think are steering students away from enrollment. But in addition to that, for the first time in a very long time, we're seeing weakening college going rates among 18-year-olds. That's the graph at the bottom that shows for the nation and for Connecticut, the immediate college going rate of recent high school graduates has actually been declining for the last 5 years or so. And that includes the pandemic, but also it's beyond just the pandemic as well. And this is on 30-something years of general increases. That's also the case for 18-year-old and traditional age populations. Those had been rising for 30 years, almost entirely without pause, everywhere in the country and in every state. And in about 2012 or so, those numbers started to shift in New England and Connecticut. And this is the so-called demographic cliff. That is impacting higher education generally. It is a little bit of a misnomer because it's not a cliff so much as a gradual decline, and it also suggests that the only students to be served are recent high school graduates, which we know is not the case. Nevertheless, that is the core population that institutions have been built to serve, and for 30 years there was no need to really question or change that because there were always more to be selected from among. Well, we've got these combined problems of weakening college going rates and declining numbers, and so it impacts the enrollment levels of institutions, particularly those with that are less capable of having a large brand name, let's say. However, it's also the case that Connecticut as a state has been unusually generous in funding its higher education institutions. These data include funding that goes to UConn and to financial aid as well, the state-funded financial aid. But if you look at just the public higher education appropriations to higher education in Connecticut, Connecticut ranks 3rd in the states in fiscal 23, trailing only Illinois and the District of Columbia on a per student basis. So as we go on to, this is our first of 4 high-level observations, and there are several graphs that we'll use to sort of illustrate this. These conditions are not likely to change in the near future. The graph on top shows that these data are from Connecticut. The number of 15 to 24-year-olds, your core population of students, is likely to continue declining through, well, I can't read that number. I think it's 2040. So there is a long-term decline in the number of individuals who will reach traditional college age during that period. It's worth noting that during that same time frame, there's an increase in the number of 35 to 44-year-olds. These are people who could be targeted for enrollment in larger numbers as a way to address some of the decline you're likely to see in your traditional age population. But by the way, the decline in traditional age students is not going to happen just in Connecticut. The graph on the bottom, this data they're going to be updated literally next week, but I don't think that they will change dramatically. It shows that there will be a decline in the number of recent high school graduates over the next 15 years, or the 15 years that began with the end of the last available data in 2019. For Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, all of the states from which Connecticut is likely to draw more students. And so what this means isn't so much, it means that the options for getting students from outside of Connecticut are not really any better than getting students from within Connecticut, but it also means that those institutions that are in those states are also going to be looking for students in Connecticut and elsewhere, and so the competition is likely to grow. Continuing on, this is information about the degree to which that intensifying competition has led to a reduction in the market share that CSU institutions generally have been able to attract from Connecticut and elsewhere. The graph on top, those two lines that fall below zero in fall of 2022 are for Connecticut State is the bottom one. The CSUs collectively is the other one. Now the CSUs were up during this period until 2018, till the pandemic started, and then fell off. But those data that pattern does not exist for UConn or its branch campuses or the private nonprofits in Connecticut, which have continued to be able to attract more students from in-state. That being said, the students who are graduating from high school and moving on to college are tending to go out of state in larger numbers, or in larger proportions anyway, over time. That's the graph on the bottom left. And the graph on the bottom right is a little complicated, so just to be real brief, it shows for example, if I'm a student that's choosing between UConn and UMass, I'm over time more likely to go to UMass than I was previously. That's the public research side. That's not true for the public comprehensives or the two-year colleges in Connecticut. If I'm choosing between Eastern or Bridgewater State, for example, I'm more likely to choose Eastern. So the CSCU institutions are not losing in-state students to out-of-state institutions to the same degree as UConn is in this particular case. Second high-level observation is that the response from CSCU to all of this enrollment decline has not quite matched the decline in enrollment, so that its costs have risen relative to enrollment and generally, and we can show this in a whole host of ways, and the appendix includes data on total expenditures to do that with money, but there are factors that cause Connecticut's costs to be higher in some cases than other states or peer institutions, and namely relatively rich fringe benefits. And so as a result, to make it a simpler comparison, we're just looking at student FTE versus employee FTE. Since employee costs represent somewhere between 70 and 80% of the total cost of higher education, this doesn't fully capture all the costs, but it does a pretty good job of illustrating that although the numbers of FTEs have fallen, of employee FTEs have fallen over time throughout the system. The numbers have not fallen as fast as student enrollments have, and so the ratio between employees and students has climbed for both instructional staff and non-instructional staff. And it's worth noting that these data do not include employees at the system office because those data are not available in iPads. A third high-level observation is that we find only limited evidence that CSCU is really being successful at undertaking system-level strategic approaches to address its current fiscal dilemmas or its future fiscal fragility. And what we point out here is that the relative to that last graph, the numbers of employees are out of alignment with declines in enrollment. But in addition, it's difficult for CSCU to put the employees where they are most needed at different campuses or in different settings or in different jobs to meet the needs of the system or of the institutions. A second issue is that the function of the system versus the institutions. So let me point out as I enter this comment that this CSCU system is a young system. It's only been around for a dozen years or so. And it has been addressing the challenges of integrating the 12 formerly independent community colleges as part of its early history, which has created tension and conflict. That being said, it still has not figured out what the right roles are for the system to conduct versus the institution to conduct. And that's a challenge to continue to work on. Second, the efforts to consolidate the services, particularly shared services, has not gone swimmingly well. And while there's been a lot of well-intentioned initiatives undertaken by the system office, they have been poorly executed or abandoned along the way. Additionally, resources that the system has not been used strategically to address the sustainability issues facing institutions. Although there is new board leadership, the oversight by the board has not been up to the task. Now, I say that in front of all you board members. Some of you have long histories. I want to acknowledge that being a board member for a set of institutions like CSU's is harder than it probably has ever been before. You are all volunteers. You are, whereas in the past, during the period of unrequited growth, your task was to make decisions that might have felt really difficult about how to allocate new resources to build new capacity, and those were important decisions, and you got lobbied and had tough ones to take. That being said, it is not the same as trying to figure out where to make cuts. And so it has been really important, I want to stress this, your efforts to engage AGB and do other work related to trying to shore up and work as a group are really important so that you can actually carry out this important task effectively. My fourth high-level observation is that there are some other factors that have limited the degree to which CSCU can operate with full autonomy to address some of the bold decision-making that's needed. We've already talked about the contextual conditions that create headwinds, but in addition to that, we identify several challenges associated with the way the state operates. First and foremost is the absence of a statewide coordinating body that addresses post-secondary education, and a lack by the state of having clear and overarching state goals that would inform the work that the board and the system office is doing to try to set goals and measure progress against them. Additionally, the state does have some responsibility for influencing salary adjustments and benefits through CBAC negotiations, although it is important to recognize that the system still and the institutions still have considerable discretion over elements that sort of set the groundwork for those changes to take place. There is no funding approach at the system office or the state level that really identifies incentives for the systems or institutions to respond to, nor addresses what the expectations are for affordability to students. There is no statewide policy for dual enrollment, and there is some dispute about this, but we heard repeatedly during our visits that there is a perception that amongst leadership that making controversial decisions, whether it's around employee compliments or facilities or anything like that, may come with consequences from the legislature, and has created some resistance to making some of those hard decisions. In addition to sort of those 4 overarching high-level observations, we also devoted some attention to several specific topics in our report. First was data governance. The system is trying to use data to drive decision-making, but this is a perfect example, in my view, of where the system is confused about its role relative to the institutions and its use of data. We believe that this institutions need data to do transactional related decision making. The system office needs more a consistent set of reliable data to inform policy and to provide feedback to the institutions that will help them make those decisions. In addition, the system has so far elected not to contribute data to P20 WIN. We believe that's problematic in an era where we really need to understand the impact of interventions on student outcomes, including employment outcomes, as well as the pipeline from K-12. And we find it problematic that we weren't able to include some of the numbers for system office employment in some of the data that I've already showed, because the system office opts not to report to IPEDS. Charter Oak deserved special attention as well. It is an interesting and relatively unique kind of institution within CSCU, although there are other states that have similar online specific institutions, such as Empire State in New York and at Thomas Edison University in New Jersey, as well as others. We suggest we address some of the challenges associated with Charter Oak as a relatively small institution that is focused primarily on a different population of students than the CSUs are, as well as its unique sort of business model and its ability to be a place where some innovation can occur within the system office, where so much of what happens is pretty prescribed by the way in which the system is operated and the agreements that it has. We also addressed space and facilities. As I said, we employed a consultant to do that, and found that there is more than sufficient amount of space in the system. There is a much more significant study of space that could be useful to CSCU to determine in more detail how spaces are being used most effectively or not, which spaces need to be updated to address current pedagogy versus what might have been built for a different time or era, as well as changes in programs. That was beyond the scope of the work that we did. I will say that there is a lack of really good data and reliable data on the kind of space that the CSCU systems have, and there is a lack of clear master plans on behalf of the institutions that is problematic as well. So there's work to be done in this space we'll talk about in a minute. I will also just add that the CSCU commissioned its own study of its space, and as well as enrollment projections going forward. And the portion of our study that addressed this and the study that they did largely say the same things. Statewide policy leadership. This is an issue in a state that has allowed investments in CSCU and in UConn and the financial aid to be uncoordinated. And so you have issues around what are the right programs to be delivered in the right places. How should funding be organized most effectively? What do we make of the degree to which CSCU institutions are or are not affected by UConn and its branch campuses? And there's a real need to better understand the role that statewide policy leadership really needs to be exercised in the state. OPM does a fair bit of that. Undersecretary Casamento happens to be really well versed in higher education, but That's only by happenstance. The next time there's a new person in that role, they may not have the level of depth of knowledge about higher education. And in that light, there will be a even bigger gap in understanding statewide policy leadership for Connecticut. And then finally, there's no appropriations. The policy for appropriating funds to CSCU, UConn, and to the financial aid programs in the state is largely based on whatever it was last year. There's not really any incentives associated with it. It's not connected to state policy and state goals. And so I think that there's really some room for addressing that both at the system office level and at the state level. So as we sort of work towards making recommendations, it became clear to us that what might be most helpful is to present a series of options for at least two of these big topics of governance and structure. The first one is the task in front of us around how to structure CSCU. And so there's sort of 6 options there. There certainly might be more. And the appendix of the slide deck includes sort of the arguments for and against each of these options, if you've seen that. The first option, and the one that we ultimately put forward as our recommendation, is to keep the current CSCU structure and system office, but it can't be underemphasized that there must be significant change in how the system office functions and is held accountable to the state's needs and is expected to serve the needs of its constituent institutions more effectively. A second one is to eliminate the system, leaving the 6 individually accredited institutions to operate without a system office. In our view, that would exacerbate the challenges of not having statewide policy leadership. It would create additional incentives for competition that's unproductive among the institutions. It would require them all to have their own boards, and as I've already said, it's hard to get a board of really qualified people who can effectively do that work. There are some advantages associated with it, but on balance, it's got problems. Another option is to eliminate the system, but designate one of the institutions to carry out system-wide functions. We think that's got problems associated with what priorities are being served most effectively in that environment. A fourth option is to return to a pre-2010 or 2011 structure with the obvious change that CT State would be a single institution rather than 12 independent ones under a system, as was the case back then. A fifth option, which is not really its own sort of mutually exclusive option, is to think about organizing the back office functions, the shared services that CSCU currently does, under a separate services organization with somewhat separate governance. Ultimately, you'll see we think that there needs to be a different way in which CSU organizes the shared services so that it borrows a market model from the rest of how our economy tends to function. Right now, its strategy of taking money off the top and then providing services does not provide enough of a functional feedback loop about whether those services are being effective. We think that there's some advantages of separating this under a separate organization with somewhat independent governance involving the presidents of the institutions to better meet the needs of the institutions. And then the sixth one, we needed to include it, but I think that it's politically infeasible to incorporate UConn into a statewide system. We also put some options on the table for a state higher education agency to address the policy leadership challenges I've mentioned. The first option is just to kind of continue to have no single body that exercises statewide coordination, and that's certainly an option. Status quo is a choice, but I think that it will continue to create the kinds of problems that we already observe. A second option is to allow OHE, the Office of Higher Education, to continue to carry out its primary tasks of managing the state financial aid program and state authorization and the statewide reciprocity agreements, while a new coordinating board is created, and then once that's created, folding OHE and its functions into that coordinating board. A third one is to create an entirely new coordinating board and leave it separate from OHE, let OHE continue to do its thing. And then the fourth is to take OHE and append functions to it and allow it to become the coordinating board. As I said, there's a set of pros and cons associated with all of those options in the back. When we thought about what recommendations we wanted to put forward, we tend to think in terms of the principles that should guide the choices that we make. And so these are the ones that typically we use at NCHEMS, and they tend to be pretty good for most states. But as you can see, we think institutions and the system itself are a means to an end. If there was another way to do workforce and talent development better than higher education institutions, we are agnostic about that. There just isn't, but that means that students and states' needs really come first and drive what institutions are really doing. We think that it's really important that everybody throughout the state is being served, no matter where they are in the state, as well as no matter what their backgrounds are. Those are the second and third issues. We find that the fourth one is sometimes really hard to actually implement. So we would argue that what we're trying to do is create the right set of relationships and organizational structures and priorities, and then building the way in which the entities and the organizations carry those out, rather than saying, well, we have this entity, we should just mash stuff together within it that may or may not make sense. So form should follow function. We know that, as we have tried to do, I mean, we are a Boulder-based organization, so we couldn't be here every week during this entire project, but we've tried to do outreach and be part of stakeholder engagement, and we believe that that is a necessary element in making the changes that go forward. You can't borrow solutions from other states. This place is unique, and so it's important that the policies that get developed take lessons maybe, but do not try to replicate exactly what other states are doing, no matter how loud and how much some of those solutions attract attention from the broader community. And then finally, active dialogue and collaboration with stakeholders will be important, because it's not just about coming up with a good idea, it's about carrying it through implementation. So the recommendations we would make is to, as I said, keep the system, require substantial changes that the board will have an important role in ensuring are carried out, that ensure that the system office is adding value to the functioning of institutions. So it's not repeating what they're doing, it's complementing what they're doing in important ways. We think that the system, so I would back up and say, in the environment I've described, the demographics that are not favorable for higher education, NCHEMS believes that systems have a unique capacity to help solve for some of those challenges in ways that individually operated institutions will not. Among those things is ensuring that programs that are relevant are available as widely as possible, so that students in relatively remote parts of your state, in northeastern Connecticut, for example, can get access to programs that are actually housed at other institutions without having to travel there. And so I think that there are benefits of scale, that's on the academic side, and on the administrative side, notwithstanding the challenges of the implementation of shared services, that a system is uniquely capable of effectuating that is much harder to do for individual institutions. But in order for it to be successful, the system has to actually be effective at doing that. So changes need to be made in how those activities are carried out. There is issues with responsiveness and communication between the system office and institutions, and issues of transparency that I think need to be solved. Obviously, there are concerns by the very nature of the work that we're doing. There's concerns about the stewardship of taxpayer and tuition funding. And so improvements in being able to demonstrate a value in doing that, the system office will have to be able to show how its presence actually helps reduce the overall burden or builds benefits that wouldn't otherwise be available to students. And there is, in our opinion, from having worked in a lot of states, a culture in which accountability just gets lost in CSCU. And it's been, forgive me, regents, it started at the regents, it's been all the way down through department managers at the institution. So there needs to be a much more effective structure for accountability in this place. A second recommendation is to create a statewide coordinating board to address the policy leadership functions and policy coordination functions. We think the second version of our options makes the most sense. And then we have a set of recommendations for CSU, followed by recommendations for the state. So we have a lot of these because there's a lot of work to be done. I tried to make fewer, but it just wasn't possible. So I don't think that it makes sense to try to attack all of these things at once. So we've tried to do a little bit of prioritization. And so the first of these that I think is really important is to put Western on firm financial footing. There are nobody in this room that I believe was really around back in 2015 when Western started bleeding its reserves. But that was allowed to continue for a very long time. And the question of Western's continued struggles really challenged the legitimacy of the system office and the system as a whole. It is essential that Western's finances and its accreditation challenges be resolved quickly. I would call this a 3-alarm fire. An inability to get this sorted out once and for all will continue to raise questions within the system and among state leadership about what the system office is really doing and the regents if it can't get this problem solved. And as many of you know, NCHIMS was hired by the system to look into Western's challenges. A couple of years ago, we made recommendations. There was progress. I'm not sure that that progress and momentum has continued. It needs to get solved, full stop. Second recommendation is really to work hard on what it means to be a system and how that's different from institutional leadership. And I'm not going to go through all of the things that are listed on this table, but it should illustrate, when you look at them, how these two kinds of organizations should complement one another. It should result in reduction in duplication, an improvement in communications, and a virtuous functioning feedback loop between institutions and systems. There should not necessarily be, well, let me move on, because number 4, I'm going to go out of order for a second. Reorganizing the system office to better align with those functions means what are the roles that the people working in the system office should be playing? Are the right people able to serve in those roles? And then once those roles are sort of clarified, it's probably timely to conduct another independent salary survey that factors in those changes to ensure that's right. It has been too simple to say, here is an institutional structure. We have a provost, we have a chief student affairs officer, we have a chief financial aid officer, and we're going to replicate that at the system office level. But the things that the system office needs to do are different. And it's not evident that the people who do that job have as challenging a task that's required to be paid at the same level that the institutional person is. I'm not saying whether that's true or not. I'm just saying that it's been too easy to just lift that structure and impose it across the institutions without really evaluating it, and then require that those individuals be paid at a higher rate than the campus people are. That does not strike me as clearly articulating the difference between those functions. These functions should be really concentrated on the educational assets. So how do we take what's available at Central and make sure that students who aren't going to come to New Britain can take advantage of that in a meaningful way, including through CT State in some cases. And so there are ways in which the combined resources of the system can be deployed more effectively. And then, as I mentioned earlier, a separate services organization we think is the best possible strategy for organizing the shared services function. To go back to number 3, this is really critical. This goes to the question of whether or not the folks that are employed across the system are employed in the right places and in the right numbers. The system should require the institutions to create staffing plans that comport with the budgetary realities they're facing with realistic enrollment projections and so forth. And this board should require the system office to do the same thing. This is an essential element of understanding where the in addressing some of the challenges of expenses being continuing to grow in the absence of student populations that are there. It's important to do this in a way that doesn't wind up looking like triage, which is what happens when, for example, people have been saying we're going to experience an economic recession for a while and it just doesn't seem to come around. But when it finally does, it's likely that the state will do some across-the-board cuts to higher education. And that is understandable, but also a not strategic way to address these challenges. So as part of the staffing plans, this institution should be clear about which programs they really believe they need to offer and what staffing they need in order to deliver those programs and to ensure student outcomes don't suffer as a consequence. We believe that there needs to be additional flexibility in the personnel policies. So now that CT State is a single institution, the human resources available and other resources available to that institution can be deployed where the needs are most acute. We think that there's a need to shift the culture towards more effective personnel management. Within the collective bargaining agreements, there are provisions to take job action where appropriate or to conduct layoffs. There has not been a culture of doing that because there has not been the acute need to do that. I think the system office can serve more effectively by providing the kind of education and training across the system to help understand how to sort of do that and to support those kinds of decisions when they are appropriate. For example, when you've decided that a program is no longer viable at your campus, then you have some changes to make. But that should be a conversation that also ensures that that program, that if there's a need for it statewide, that there's somewhere that program is being offered and there's strategies to serve those populations that use it. We think that the system needs to develop and implement a resource allocation model. My understanding is that that's underway. I have not seen a version of it, but it's really important to have a better approach to allocating money to the institutions than largely based on what was the funding last year. The board policy on reserves, there's a graph in the report that talks about the rapid growth in the CSCU reserves. And although I think it's good practice to build reserves, the board policy has some flaws that I think can be addressed in how those reserves are most effectively used to create transformation. I will say this, there's two ways to transform. One is to cut and everybody sort of responds. The other way is to be strategic about it and invest in transformation. And there are some impediments in the way the reserve policy is written that don't best allow for the system to say, this is the transformation we want to see. In order to do that, we've got to pay faculty members to consult with us on it during the summer. There's costs associated with those things. And there needs to be a way to sort of fund the kind of transformation that will reduce expenditures over time. The ninth one is to really provide guidance to institutions on budget development and implementation. We've offered a strategic framework in the strategic budgeting framework in the report and to Chancellor Cheng and Lloyd about how to think about possibly using that going forward. Included in this is this habit of using federal stimulus one-time money to pay for recurring costs has not been helpful and has left CSU on the precipice of having some significant challenges going forward in funding their enterprise. Obviously, it's important, one of the important roles that a system office can carry out is to really put the focus on students' needs in different ways that institutions do. And among those are really trying to build smooth pathways through a variety of institutions towards credentials, helping to articulate the value of credentials embedded in curricula throughout the system, how an institution can use its resource allocation strategies to help make college more affordable, and to really understand the data on what is helping students make their way into the workforce and providing that kind of feedback back to the institution. So I think there's real value in there. The system office should enhance its capacity to use data. That includes the system office doing analysis on behalf of institutional leadership and not simply just being a collector of data. So for example, we made a huge request of the system office and it landed in the data provider's lap to some degree. And that was an intense process that the institutions undertook to provide us with data. My understanding is that happens regularly, and there is nothing that really kind of goes back to the institution from all that effort. And I think that there's a better way to serve the institutions with data and information. We also think it's really important for the system to contribute data to P20 WIN. My background includes a lot of work trying to get states to bring data across K-12, higher education, and workforce together. I got institutions, I got states, 4 states, to contribute identifiable data across those states, across those 3 domains into one data set a decade ago. There are ways to get this done, and it's time to move that effort forward more effectively. I think that I mentioned the AGB work that the board has been doing. I applaud that. I think more efforts to foster board effectiveness are called for in this because of the challenges facing CSU and the board in overseeing the system. I think as a part of that, it would be useful for the board to have a list of items that require board attention and approval. My sense is that there's been a few things that have slipped by the board and its oversight previously, and the board does not need to be caught by surprise about things that are going forward as well. And then finally, we offer some thoughts on what Charter Oak can and should be, but we think that it's really important that the board figure out how best to use that unique asset. And I know Chair Glay has commissioned a working group to study that. For the state of Connecticut, we think that it's important to establish a statewide coordinating agency to manage the investments and to advise the governor, OPM, and the legislature on investments the state is making in higher education, and to ensure that the needs of the state are being elevated and served most effectively. We think that it's timely to conduct a strategic plan for the state, higher education. The legislature in 2023, I think, passed some funding to do that I understand has been swept, but it still needs to be done. We think the funding model for higher education, much like the resource allocation model from the system, needs a look and needs to be tuned to the needs of the future. We think that there has been a habit by the state to speaks loudly about the funding challenges facing the state and then somehow coming up with additional resources to close gaps that are being put forward. That I know that everybody in this room is grateful for the additional money that the legislature came up with during the last session. That being said, it is important that the plan be adhered to some degree so that people really understand that what the state is going to offer is this amount, and we need to make some changes. The capital budget process, I didn't mention this as part of CSU, but I should have. There needs to be a way for CSU to prioritize its requests to OPM more clearly and in concert with campus-specific facilities master plans. And it should use a rubric to help identify which of those things rise to the top of the list, so that when the capital budget process reaches OPM, there's clarity about why these choices are being put forward as the priorities, recognizing that there's going to be scarce resources and not all projects will be funded. But that message needs to be sent much more clearly to OPM, and then OPM needs to use a similar rubric for funding higher education. We also made some recommendations in the CSCU part related to putting a moratorium on, a temporary moratorium on new square footage being added to the current amount until there's high-quality data to support facilities master plans that really will help tee up a much more constructive conversation with the state about the needs of the system on facilities. We think that there should be a requirement for continued training and evaluation of board members, not just CSUs, but UConns and as well. We also think that I don't want, this seventh one is about not falling into the trap of simply looking at the employee FTE, the system office, and saying that it's grown, therefore it's bad. If the system office is effective and if it is driving scale, it may justifiably need to have more resources to do that. We should be honest about that. We shouldn't just be moving people and assignments around to justify a lower FTE to the system office. But the system office has got to be able to demonstrate its value in order for that to be effective. There are often policies that work in conflict with one another at the state level. An example is if we are needing CSU to serve more adult learners, do our financial aid programs really support that or not? And what is in the way of doing that? So there's a need to do a policy audit on the state level. And then finally, we think there's a need for a statewide policy that supports dual enrollment more effectively than what currently exists, which is more of a free-for-all, and so on. So I will wrap up my comments with just some concluding remarks. Kind of go back to the beginning. We know at NCHEMS that these institutions the board oversees are vital to the future of Connecticut and to its various different regions. We know that the system office is at an inflection point in its 12-year history. It really needs to step up and be able to demonstrate its effectiveness and efficiency, and to ensure that as we continue to see enrollment challenges and make difficult decisions, that the system office is doing some things that really help ensure that students can still get access to the relevant programs they need. There needs to be some change to the system. There's a legitimacy challenge with the system office. You all, I know the folks at the system office are hard at work every day. There needs to be some significant change in how it functions to make it more effective, and those changes are necessary and urgent. And then finally, the state has some role to play in ensuring that the system collectively is as successful as possible. And so with that, I think have I overstayed my welcome? A little bit, but I hope that that provides a little bit of a good overview of the report, and I'm happy to take questions.
We'll let you know tomorrow if you did, Brian. Thank you so much. Very comprehensive. And of course, the report, as I told you, took me about 4.5 hours, not including my breaks. But certainly a lot of content in there and a lot of reality, which I appreciate, and data-driven. I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Helene to manage the Q&A from the board members, ex officios, and institutional leaders.
Thank you, Chair Gway. Questions from the regents? Regent Porth.
Well, I first want to say thank you. Clearly, a lot of work went into this, and as I mentioned to you earlier, we are open and eager to learn, and all of us are motivated by our mission to serve our students and to build as strong an institution as possible. Especially interested in some of your research and recommendations as to how the pipeline works, and frankly, in particular, the dual enrollment issue. CT Mirror just ran a few articles on this issue too. It's an issue across the state for us. We have to figure that out. And I appreciate your reference to that in here. I just, one of the things that stands out in your report is the cost per FTE. And a lot of that has to, I know you know this, you even alluded to it in your presentation, a lot of that has to do with a long-standing practice in Connecticut of the state government negotiating contracts on behalf of the colleges and universities. And the other issue that you talk about is the need to be more nimble, to move more quickly when enrollment changes in different places and when the desire for certain types of courses changes as well. That's sometimes constrained by some of the same working condition policies that go into our contracts and our general policies. All of that is to say, we hear you, we want to do this right, we appreciate your advice, but we need state government leadership to be equal partners with us in this. And we need our employees to work with us if we're to achieve some of the most important recommendations in your report. Can you give us advice on how to get to that? Because we can't do it on our own. I maybe shouldn't have said it that way. We are eager to do our part. We're on a mission here, literally, but we can't do it on our own.
So I acknowledge that, you know, what you're saying. I think that that you have my sense is that there's a lot more flexibility that the institution has than it is currently exercising around some of these conversations. But I do think that it will involve, I see Kalina, here, and Dr. Cunningham, who's got his hand up on the screen as members of the Faculty Advisory Council. There is a need to engage the faculty in these conversations. I think that part of what needs to be done is a review of programs. The system office, one of the initiatives the system office undertook on its own a year or so ago, that I think was, those are hard conversations to carry out, but they need to happen. There needs to be a rubric and an understanding of how that works. We recently did a project related to that in South Dakota that tries to understand how complicated that question actually is, because it's not just how many degrees you're producing in English. It's about how many students the English department is serving in their gen ed curriculum. It's about how many upper division courses are you offering versus lower division courses. They're out of balance in South Dakota on that. That might be the case here, but that's a conversation that needs to happen within the family, as it were, with real data and information and open ears. And I think that and the same thing happens when you reach out to OPM and the legislature and other members of the state, that there's a real need to demonstrate a real commitment to having those difficult conversations internally, and to getting some support from the state to have those.
Thank you, Brian.
Professor Cunningham. I had Professor Cunningham's hand up next. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd first like to respond to Regent Porth's remarks and also some remarks from Brian about comparing expenditures on our campuses to other states. We do not exist in a vacuum. By many measures, the K through 12 educational achievement gap in Connecticut is one of the worst in the country, and it has worsened over the past 5 or 6 years. What that means is we need more resources to achieve what other states achieve with public higher education, and I find it unacceptable to steer around that reality of our campuses and our classrooms. Secondly, I have 2 questions for the board, and my questions are questions I would like you to ask yourselves as regents. Both questions are based upon published investigative journalism relating to NCHEMS. Do you as regents know if NCHEMS was the best choice for this analysis? According to a September 12th, 2019 article by Bill and Sandy Britt published in the Alabama Political Reporter, a higher education administrator in Alabama selected NCHEMS for a study, but the administrator also received payment from the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, an organization which, quote, played a leading role in the creation of NCHEMS. This appearance of tit-for-tat payment is highly troubling and casts a troublesome shadow over the ethics of NCHEMS. Do we know if anyone on Connecticut's state payroll has received payment from NCHEMS, Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, or the State Higher Education Executive Officers? All 3 organizations have offices in the same building as NCHEMS. Did payola play any role in selecting NCHEMS over better experts like our own faculty and students? Second question I would like the regents to ask themselves. Continuing on the theme of questionable ethics, do you as regents know if NCHEMS misrepresented any information in this report? According to an April 16th article by Bethany Barnes in the Las Vegas Review-Journal entitled "Emails Show Nevada Higher Ed Agency Misled Legislature on Funding Study," the misrepresentation within NCHEMS reports is a legitimate concern. A quote from that article: "So close was the relationship that the think tank reportedly let system officials write a memo under NCHEMS letterhead." According to this report, NCHEMS was apparently just a puppet for another party in the state in order to falsely cloak that party's opinion in independence. In other words, a paying NCHEMS client in Nevada wrote material that NCHEMS placed on their letterhead, according to this investigative journalism. I suppose plagiarism isn't exactly the right way to describe this, since NCHEMS was claiming authorship of material written by someone else, reportedly. But in this case, the author wanted it that way. Do we know if someone in Connecticut, perhaps someone on Connecticut's payroll, wrote part of this NCHEMS report but hid their involvement under NCHEMS letterhead, as reported previously by the Las Vegas Review-Journal? I don't think we know that, and given these 2 startling reports on unethical behavior, I think there is no way we can accept this report as the basis for any decisions regarding how to run CSCU. Thank you.
I guess I'll have to address that. Those are certainly the reports that are out around around Nevada and Alabama. The Nevada incident happened before my time at NCHEMS. It is also a report that needs to be taken with a grain of salt. I would dispute the characterization from what I know of how that went down. The issues in Alabama were around the selection of institutional peers, driven largely by Auburn University not particularly liking the ones that we had done. There is nothing unethical about being an organization that was incubated at WICHE in the 1960s and became a separate, entirely separate 501c3 in 1973. We work with WICHE from time to time. WICHE is a government organization with a congressional charter from the federal government, and it has a 48-member board that is gubernatorial appointed by its 16 members. We have nothing, it is a nonprofit just as we are. There is nothing shady whatsoever about any relationship that we have with WICHE or with SHIO. We happen to share a building because the Ford Foundation believed it to be valuable for the three organizations that conduct complementary work to live and play together in 2005 when we agreed to obtain a building. And I resent the implication, Dr. Cunningham, that there's anything unethical about any of what you have outlined at all. There is also nothing we are not receiving any money whatsoever or have not paid off any people in Connecticut. That's absolutely outrageous, and I think that that's the kind of assertion that will not help your institutions move forward.
May I respond to that?
Professor Cunningham.
Thank you. I guess I was a little bit confused because you were advocating for transparency. This is transparency. This is public reporting about your organization that was not on the table until I brought it up. If we want transparency, let's be real, and that's what I just offered.
And I just addressed it, sir.
Thank you. Regent Yang.
Hello. Well, thank you for this report. It's good to see that we're getting other opinions from outside professionals like yourself, Brian, and your team. My questions are around technology and the evolving state of higher education. The report doesn't touch too much about that in terms of topics such as generative AI, topics such as certificates for technology, especially for some of these younger job seekers in those fields that are very rapidly growing, as well as it does touch somewhat obviously on Charter Oak and online, but also the kind of ongoing cycle of that and where you think. If you could comment about those factors, and I don't know whether you've got further documentation or whatever, but just certainly just ad hoc if you could comment upon some of those.
Yeah. So I think that there's, it's a great question. There's multiple different ways to sort of address it. One is about the pedagogy that AI opens up as possible changes to how we teach and instruct and learn. Another is these are skills and abilities that students and graduates will actually need to be effective in the workforce, and so how do we engage that kind of content into the curricula in meaningful ways? That is, in ways that a student can point to, I have this degree and I have these particular kinds of skills. I have a certificate to show for it. I think that those are curricular conversations that the system office, if it's functioning well, creates dialogue around, because the system office, one of the potential failures, I'm not saying it's necessarily the case here, is that it's the system office and it knows best, and that's not true. The idea is to get engagement from folks within the faculty ranks throughout the system to really sort of amplify what is useful around how are we using the tools we have to build the skills that students need, but also how are we using some of these tools to effectively deliver and cast education more broadly. Whether it's AI, whether it's new programming languages, whether it's whatever, I think that's really important. AI is a particularly interesting one, though, because it's impossible to wrap your arms around it. It covers everything. It isn't like advanced manufacturing, which is really big and broad and complicated, but there's like, how is AI going to affect advanced manufacturing? How is it going to affect the delivery of education? How is it going to affect scholarship in English? How is it going to affect scholarship in engineering and in healthcare and all those kinds of things? This is an opportunity for the system office really to have a dialogue around something that's that complex that says, and one of the things we called for is operational missions of the institution, so that Western and Eastern are not differentiated largely, that's a bad example, but Southern and Central are not differentiated largely by the directional name, but meaningful differences in the students that they're serving, not just geographically, but with programs. So somebody's going to need to create programs around AI. Which institution is going to create which programs with what concentrations is a dialogue that I think that the system office should have in light of the institutional missions that should be differentiated among the institutions. How is that? Did that answer your question?
That was good. Are there any comments regarding how this may impact the fiscal or financial standpoints, or is it too early to tell?
I think that again, taking AI as an example, creating some of those programs will have costs. You need to decide what you're not going to do in order to allow for some of those costs to be created. I think that it's also not that simple. If you're creating some programs that are of real utility and value in the workplace, and you use money to sort of seed the development of some of those programs, and it returns enrollments, those enrollments on an ongoing basis, those enrollments need to be funded and not just on the basis of tuition. So I actually think that there needs to be a complementary state. This is why I'm talking about the resource allocation budgeting policy at the state level. There needs to be some recognition that the institution is serving different programs up to more students that are relevant. That needs to be paid for on some, at least partially on some level. So I think that there's costs associated with, seeding and developing and expanding the program array that you offset in part with your reserves and some investments from the state, and you cut some other programs that are not nearly as relevant. And then the ongoing costs need to be factored in terms of, do those programs cost the same, or do they cost different amounts? There are fewer students as a result of those things. All of that needs to be factored into the dialogue about funding.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Regent Yang. We're moving to Regent Santiago, followed by Professor Sasanker.
Thank you, appreciate that. Brian, thank you very much for the report and the presentation and the work that went into it. In reference to the earlier comments, I was reminded of a Carl Sandburg quote that says, if the law is against you, argue the facts. If the facts are against you, pound the table. And I'd like us to be focused on the facts, and very happy that you guys worked hard to get some in front of us. What I'm wondering is, as you look around the country and what NCHEMS has worked on and otherwise, where do you see parallels with other systems to the challenges that we're facing? And as a corollary to that, maybe you've seen systems that have these parallels that have been successful in overcoming them or moving in the right direction, or conversely, systems where they've made some moves that have either made the situation worse or not had a positive impact. I wonder if you could share any of that context as we will end up moving forward and choosing actions, looking at peers to see what they've done and how that's resulted could be very helpful.
Great question. I think that there are places let me back up. I think there are limited models for the time that we're entering in, especially on the public sector side. Back to some original comments I made earlier, for very long, for the careers of most everybody around the table, that graduated from college in the late 80s, let's say, or later, it's all been about growth until just recently. And so there hasn't been a need to build out some of these tools and models. That being said, there has been a recognition that there needs to be some aggregation of scale in some places that I think is appropriate. I would be looking at some of the things that are going on in places that are even more acutely impacted than Connecticut, like Vermont, that's trying to preserve the presence of higher education institutions in some of its most rural spaces where they can't afford to have an institution that operates independently. Maine has tried to do some things to try to address some of its challenges, and even some of the most remote campuses in Maine are having success trying to reach some college no degree students with innovative program offerings, leveraging technology to provide some of them. So I think there's some examples there. Trying to think through, every system's a little bit different. There are a whole bunch of systems that are sector specific across the country, and then there are statewide systems like the University of Hawaii that includes the flagship as well as the community colleges and everything in between. And all of them struggle with some of these challenges that we're talking about and facing, but are starting to work on collaborative solutions. I think it makes sense to try to, where it makes sense, I think it's important to aggregate resources, centrally, to do things like provide a stable of instructional designers that faculty throughout the system can tap, rather than locating them and saying you can only work with faculty at our campus, for example. I think there's a real risk of mistaking how to do that and pulling resources that really need to be on the ground in front of students and employees to meet those needs. But the policy environment or the policy decisions that surround whatever that function is can be centralized to some degree. And I think that and I'm trying to think about examples that are really good at doing that. I'll have to get back to you on it, because I'm on the hot seat right now, and that's not really easy to do. So.
No, fair enough, Brian. And look, in the spirit of wanting to get to the facts, I would appreciate if you wouldn't mind following up. I don't know the proper protocol to get that, but when you've had some time to think about it, I would appreciate some follow-up.
Thank you, Regent Santiago. We're moving to Professor Sasanker, followed by Regent James.
Thank you. So, the premise of this report seems to be taking for granted the lack of state support for our system and the expectation that we should expect that will continue going forward. It hasn't taken into consideration the actual financial, resources of the state and how those might be used for the future. Now that makes sense. I understand that this was a study commissioned by the Office of Policy and Management, which is very much the budget office. So this is a perspective on the system that deals with how do we control costs, how do we justify costs, and that is, again, it's appropriate. It is the right question to ask of the budget office. The question I have to ask is, and this relates to a lot of the suggestions, the recommendations that have been made for restructuring that might roll in things like the Office of Higher Ed, et cetera. Where is the office that looks at the needs of the state and understands how higher ed may serve those needs, costs it out, and decides whether or not we could or should afford it, right? It's not the OPM study, surely. It hasn't been the system office for structural reasons, I believe. It hasn't been the Board of Regents also for structural reasons, given the close relationship between the executive office and the board, so that it is the perspective of whoever is in that office that will govern the scope of the board, right? So I just want to make sure that we understand that this report is a budget report. It's not a higher ed, or it's a report that comes from an expectation that the state can and should do no more than it has. And I don't think that that's a fair expectation. And I encourage all of you to, if you haven't, look at the response that AUP prepared. It is online. And I know most of us might not have had time to read it. I was scanning through it very quickly during the meeting. And you know, this report itself, the NCHEMS report, was provided fewer than 24 hours before we met here today. So many of us have not read a whole lot of this. So all that to say, so I appreciate the report from the perspective that it has been provided. I want to note that I believe it was NCHEMS who also, you said, did not recommend the consolidation of the community colleges, but did provide input on the implementation of the consolidation. There are a lot of failures documented in your report now on that very thing, which you provided input on, and that also came from a perspective of the assumption that we just need to get smaller and smaller and provide less and less. But we live in a ridiculously wealthy state. It is expensive to live here. As you point out, we in CSDU do not lose students to other states the way UConn does, because we serve a particular demographic. So what you're saying is the demographic that we serve are the students who would not get access to higher education should we not provide it to them and provide it at an affordable rate, right? And I think that that's a very important conversation to be having as a board that is concerned with the issue of how the state provides higher education to its, its residents. We have a state where we have 169 towns and more boards of education than there are towns, which means that the kinds of students that we serve are going to be particularly, they're so diverse, the diversity of preparation exists, and these kinds of analyses, I think, are missing from this report. Again, this is a budget report, right? Commissioned by or rather, it is commissioned from the perspective of OPM, understood, but there is another perspective that needs to be addressed. And if it's the Office of Higher Ed, if it's the system office, I think somebody needs to have that task. Statewide, somebody needs to actually have that task, and we are not doing that here. So I agree completely with the idea that duplication of functions at the level of the system with the assumption that they'll just do something is inappropriate. I think that that is the unique task that we are missing. And again, our level of funding has been sliding significantly, and there are a lot of things that, in addition to the reduction in the block grant, we also have to look at the differences in the way that fringe has been compensated from, again, OPM, the way that funding of salaries has been dealt with, again, through OPM. There's a lot of pressure in the direction of getting smaller and smaller. But the reason our students struggle and the reason our enrollments fail may just be that we are not capable of serving them as we should. So I just want to insert that, and that's it.
There's some things that you said that I agree wholeheartedly with. I think that it's our recommendations about a state policy coordination body is specifically to that. I think that there's one of the dilemmas without having one is that no one necessarily has the specific responsibility of looking after the needs of the state and the diversity of the students it serves. I think I also agree that this report, while it does do some of the sub-state level analysis, there's considerably more that can be done, and that should be some of the sort of the value return that the system office exercises to the institutions that serve those folks. I think that one thing that I think is important to say in response to the overall wealthy state comment is that that's a political policy decision that the voters make with respect to who they put in the governor's office and the legislature, and sort of out of scope for us. But I will also, and two other things to say about that. One is It's nevertheless true that even if Connecticut could afford more, the way in which we look at it tends to be in comparison to what other states are doing, and you saw graphs showing the generosity of Connecticut to higher education, and a graph that talks about the degree to which Connecticut funds or taxes itself to provide general fund support for a whole array of things that I think are germane to that point. But more to the point is this question about resource allocation strategy. I don't necessarily think that our report is saying that always and forever enrollments are going to inevitably go down. We do enrollment projections in this report that do say that, which assumes a whole bunch of trended information, but also actual population data going forward. That being said, my response to Mr. Yang's question is around, you create the right programs that meet the needs of the student population. Some of those enrollment declines can be addressed. And if that's the case, then I think that there's a resource allocation strategy that should be responsive to those changes. And right now, that's not what the state has, and it's not what the system has. So I think that's an important element to try to account for some of those things.
If you don't mind, one question, and because I didn't have time to read the whole thing, in terms of the understanding of how generous Connecticut is, like in the per student, is that, it's because it's Connecticut and DC, right? But we're also one of the most expensive states in the country to live in. Is that made in comparison to cost of living in those states?
Yes.
And, okay, thanks.
The data are
Okay.
including those adjustments.
Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. We're moving to Regent James and then followed by Student Regent Sanchez. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate very much the thorough, thoughtful, comprehensive report that NCHEMS has created, and the breadth of both experience and knowledge and exposure to other systems, and to bring that us into that kind of context. I also appreciate, frankly, the bravery of some of the challenging and findings and critical findings that you have reported at every level in terms of where we are. A couple of questions for you. Number one is, you have had the experience where other systems have converted to a system strategy and obviously encountered obstacles, made mistakes along the way, just as we have. Based on that, it's one of those things where one can recover and learn from past experiences and improve those areas that that are so important that you've identified, or there are might be some assumptions that one cannot recover. I'd just like to get your take on that in terms of the breadth of missteps, and my interpretation of the report is that those missteps can be addressed, and that this is a recommendation of how to move forward. And I want to make sure I don't want to put words in your mouth in terms of that, but can you respond to that overall sense of, is this, can we move forward? Can we improve? Can we put this back on sort of the right tracks and the right intention of what this is always about, which is improving the overall quality of education we provide our students?
I mean, I think the answer to that question is yes. As I said, I believe that systems create opportunities that their absence does not make easy. And so, but I think that the reality is that the institutions should manage their own affairs on the day-to-day operations of the institutions, and the system office largely needs to get out of that work and instead focus on where are the holes between what the institutions are providing and what the students of the state and the communities and the employers of the state really need. That's where the system office should be focusing its attention on. And and those are policy leadership questions, right? There are things that the system office can facilitate about management of the institutions, but right now it's trying to do some of those management functions for them. And I don't think that that's the best, wisest use of system-wide resources. I think there are ways to organize the delivery of the kinds of things that institutions need on a day-to-day basis in ways that spread the overhead costs of delivering some of those things out beyond just the individual institutions. But as a general rule, the thing that the systems really are supposed to add value to, in my judgment, is where the institution's sort of responsibility in day-to-day management kind of stops, and where there are ways that the system can step in and say, we need to make sure that students' needs are being met. We need to make sure that that employers and communities' needs are being met, and we need to be creative in how we deliver those things that go beyond the traditional roles of the individual institutions.
And one of the things one of the many things that the report pointed out is the need to place some real emphasis on improvement of communications, clarity, transparency, improvement of data usage and data gathering, and all of those pieces. You did not talk at all yet about the need for us to really improve both our process discipline as well as the project management, where that expertise lies within both the system and the overall institution.
Yeah, I think that's so. In the work that we were involved in Vermont, this is a good. There are a few examples that are worth pointing out, not just for the kind that Regent Santiago asked for, like good examples, but then there's some things to not do. So one of the things that the system office in Vermont did poorly in the pre-2020, pre-pandemic timeframe is they decided, and I think for good reason, to centralize payroll. It doesn't matter whether you're a higher education institution or McDonald's, you need a payroll system, and it's easier to manage it. It's an easy overhead thing to sort of aggregate and spread across the institutions, and it's more efficient that way. So they did that, but they did it with poor project management, and it failed. Now, how do you think the students, the students too, but the employees felt about the legitimacy and competence of the system when payroll checks are not being processed appropriately? It was a fiasco, and it raised questions about the legitimacy of that system office. And it wasn't that it was a bad idea, it was just really poorly project managed. And in higher education, we have a habit, I feel like, of being faculty tend to be very entrepreneurially minded. They're their own kind of consultants in some. You could imagine them as their own kind of consultants in some respects, and that kind of attitude rolled up to the system office doesn't really get projects effectively managed. That's a different kind of discipline, and you have to hire for that kind of skill for something as complex as even a payroll rollout. So our report does talk about the need for really finding the necessary kind of project management experience that allows some of these very well-intentioned initiatives, whether it's around the bookstore or it's around general education curriculum or whatever it is. There is a really sort of dialed-in project management discipline that people don't naturally just get because they're assigned projects to do. They've actually had to build that over the course of time. And so I think that there's some real value in trying to write a position description or a role for doing those kinds of activities, and then not trying to do all of them at once, because then they'll constantly get confused.
And you just triggered the idea that these are things that happen over time. These are long-term commitments and solutions, and yet we have to really manage those long-term solutions with managing also to a biannual budget. And I think that is one of the challenges that we have as a system, that focus, the intense focus and intensity of the short-term budgetary pressures juxtaposed with the longer-term strategic efforts that we need to undertake to dramatically change things. And so if you would like to just comment on that. That's my last question.
I think you're right. I think you've got to prioritize. I think you need to prioritize ones that are going to have an impact with ones that you can do in a short amount of time, because you need to show the public and the policymakers that there's some wins along the way. But I also think that if you've accumulated a considerable amount of reserves that are divided up into different buckets and are needed for future challenges, of course. But some of that money should be invested strategically to try to get some of these, or some of that money. It's a question for the regions. How do we leverage some of the resources that we've set aside to really accelerate a particular project or two that will have an impact in the short term?
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Dr. Dennis Jones with NCHEMS. Did you want to add a comment to this response?
Not to this response, but I want to go back to Professor Cunningham's point about NCHEM's legitimacy, and particularly the Nevada story that he referred to. And I would just also indicate that as a result of that story, an independent investigation with a separate legal firm was initiated in Nevada, investigated NCHEM's role, and NCHEMS was given a completely clean bill of health. We were found innocent of any wrongdoing. I want to make that point very clear.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
May I respond since he mentioned my name?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Professor Cunningham.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, would you please forward that report to the Board of Regents?
I'm not sure that I can even find it now, but I will try. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. We're going to move to Student Regent Sanchez, and then I believe Chancellor Chang has a comment as well.
Thank you. I just want to echo what Regent Yang mentioned about I guess I'm shifting a little bit the question towards kind of more like of the student input that was implemented into this report. I saw that you guys highlighted in your final report that you guys did use, you conducted sessions of engaging with the students during campus visits, right? I believe the student input is very important, especially when it comes to making decisions for like long-term sustainability of the whole system, as we are going to be serving the students who obviously demographics are rapidly changing, but also the needs of the students and what they want out of the universities also are changing. I believe that students are being sold this idea that after you complete your 4 years, you can reach and complete a degree that leads to meaningful employment. So I just want to hear your perspective about kind of how do you see CSCU institutions more systematically implementing the student input into making more the student input into potentially creating more policies that more align with the students' perspectives as they're kind of the ones that we are serving towards.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we make a point. I'm not sure everybody else in the work that sort of parallels what we do tries as hard to get to student input, but it's hard because we want a diverse perspective from students. And it's easy to get the ones that are more involved and hard to get the ones that are sort of in and out of campus. But I think that it's really critical that the system, I think it's a sort of a cascading design in which the institutions take the initial step to ensure that there's some institution, so that there's a diverse array of students, not just the people who have the time to be in student government. That's an important informant, but it's the easy one to get. You ensure that there's others as well that are being heard from, and then roll that up to the system so that the system can benefit from the knowledge as well. There should be a regular kind of outreach by the system office to sort of aggregate the information from the students. I would point also to a data source that's in our report. It's kind of confusing. There's a section there called intent to enroll. This is because I think it's important not to just get the perspective of the students, but of the people who might be students if it weren't for something that got in the way of their enrollment. And so what we've provided in the intent to enroll section is data we haven't ever reported before because it's from a proprietary source that uses voter registration information to really try to pick apart whether there's interest in enrolling at the community college or in a four-year institution by town within Connecticut. And it's pretty comprehensive and shows some interesting things about the degree to which there's variation in the population of individuals without a bachelor's degree who would want to enroll. So how do you go and get that information? That data is pretty helpful. You might be able to use it to actually ask some questions, but I think that you've got, that it's an important part of the feedback loop to ensure that student voices are being heard. And I think the system office can also be helpful in training the institutions and back and forth about how to get the best information out of students. When we do our focus groups, we always do them. Probably 70% of the focus groups with the students don't really tell us anything we don't already know. But the 30% that do tell us things that are really helpful, like more helpful than some of the other focus groups that we run. And so it's really important to sort of help try to tee up the right questions, get the right people. There's a whole sort of strategy and method that could be used to sort of make sure that that information filters up.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to Chancellor Chang, followed by Regent Bloom, followed by Regent Wright.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to be quick. So first, I want to just recognize that this is a hard moment to be in, right, for all of us, whether it's board members, institutional leaders, faculty, staff, students, because we are facing some pretty significant challenges. I also want to recognize that I believe that every single one of us from every stakeholder group and every perspective wants the same thing, which is the betterment of this system, the betterment of our institutions, and the improvement and ultimately the long-term sustainability, viability, and high-level efficacy of what we provide, which I still believe is one of the greatest superpowers of our country, right, which is education and higher education, right? So I just want to kind of frame some of my comments through that lens of trying to unify around this common goal. We all want things to be stronger and better for the long term. I do want to also just really thank our faculty and labor partners for being engaged and for exercising their voice and really sharing their perspectives with genuine honesty as we are all trying to be as transparent as possible. So in that spirit, I just want to make a few comments to say that some of these recommendations we are, as a system, already taking action on, and I think that's a really good thing, right? So I'll just go through very quickly the system versus the institutions. Brian, clearly pointed out that this is a young system. We are not SUNY, we are not CUNY, we are not Cal State, we are not decades or generations old, and so there is still a lot of learning. We all know that historically this system got off to a bit of a rocky start, right? If you look back to 2010, 2011, And so there have definitely been some bumps in the road, but we are making progress in terms of defining what does the system office or the system do versus what do the institutions do. To that end, duplication is a very concerning element. One of the items that I think had been noted was the need for a provost at the system office. In my time, we have worked through that role and determined that a provost is not necessarily required at the system office. We will have, associate vice chancellors and vice chancellors in particular areas, but not necessarily a provost. So that provost position at the system office has been eliminated. We are constructing and have put together system-wide councils. And so ultimately, we want to position the system as a conduit, an aggregator of expertise and people power and best practices across our systems. We have across the system, we have incredible talent and knowledge and acumen at our institutions. Let's take advantage of that. Right? Let's bring all those folks together and let the system office, I've been using this kind of corny metaphor, but I don't mind saying it here, the system office is the pit crew, okay? But the institutions are the race cars. We have to make sure that these race cars are at their top, highest performing levels, right? That's our job as a system. Right? We got to make sure that we're helping the institution. So I really agree with that element of the report's recommendations, because ultimately that's how we're going to best help students. The P20 win, the information sharing and so forth, I know that that's been an ongoing dialogue. I'm happy to say that we are making progress, and I think we've identified a path to clear that so that there will no longer be any discrepancies there. In terms of sustainability and viability, looking at data, looking at demographics, this board passed a resolution to create 5-year sustainability plans that take into account the current biennium proposals, but also look to at least 3 out years, right? So on the one hand, this is a daunting task because we have to look at enrollment trends, we have to look at agnostic objective data, and that is going to paint a relatively difficult picture when we consider the possibility of not having enhanced state funding. That said, I think it's also an opportunity for each institution to paint the picture of what investment could look like, right? And what do our institutions look like when we have the resources that we think we need, that we can show that we need to really support those students. So I completely agree about the data situation for the system office. Again, part of the growing pains of a younger system is that we don't have a coordinated, unified data access. I completely agree with you and the report, Brian, that Western is a primary focal point because Western is too important an institution for us to let it not feel supported and not be successful the way it wants and needs to be. Right, so we have to make some really hard decisions there, and I'm happy to say that we're taking some very strong concerted efforts from the system office perspective to work directly with Western to really get them on the path that they want to be on, they deserve to be on. We talk about legitimacy. When we're talking about the history at Western, when we're talking about the history of the community college merger, we can't go back and change the decisions that were made. Right? And lamenting the past is not going to help us chart a path forward into the future. But we can recognize how we got here, and we can recognize the challenges that were a part of that, but now we have to look forward, or else we're not going to earn legitimacy. We have to overcome what happened at Western, internalize that, and move on. We have to look at what happened with the community college merger, talk about an initiative that was well-intentioned, but let's be honest, was not executed terribly well for a period of time. That hurt our legitimacy. We cannot change the past, but we can absolutely address it by moving forward into the future, and that is what's going to help us with our legitimacy as we move ahead. So I'll stop there. I really do appreciate the work of NCHEMS, and I really do appreciate all of our faculty and our staff, our bargaining unit leaders, because again, we're on the same page here, and that's where my administration and the board are as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. Regent Bloom. Regent Bloom?
Stamp, thank you. I was just unmuting. Thank you, I have a few comments about, some of them about areas that the report does not touch on very much that are, I think, important to what we're doing, and some of the other aspects of this. In one sense, the report is outdated. The board leadership has changed dramatically since this report. The body of this report was written. There is a reference in the foreword to the fact that there is new board leadership that is proceeding differently from the past. And I think, if anything, that's an understatement. Chairman Gay has made clear that the North Star of what we're doing is student success. And I think that that provides an overall direction. I think that, as Chancellor Chang said, that is something we all support and we're all here for. There are difficulties, I think, that are not always recognized in this, and remedying which, unfortunately, require investment of resources. One of the classic school finance cases in the country, Sheff versus O'Neill, took place in the city of Hartford, and the quality of education that minority students in the city of Hartford were receiving. And this case has went on, and some offshoots are still in some ways going on. The students, the minority students in Hartford, based on the findings in those cases, were woefully unprepared to go forward. And, it's often said, well, each level of education has an excuse about the fact that the level below it wasn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. But I think one of the things that's happening in Connecticut is there has been a real focus on what is and isn't happening in K through 12. That produces in the universities a need for things like wraparound student services, which we did not have in the same emphasis 15 or 20 years ago. The pandemic, and there are more and more studies about student loss during the pandemic, which also has to be addressed. The role of graduate and professional education in CSCU, not really mentioned here to any great extent. What about pre-med, pre-law, all the graduate and professional education programs that many of the students are interested in? Financial aid is a key part of what we're doing. Administration of financial aid is itself a serious and costly undertaking that has to be supported. I think it's an easy answer to say move resources from one place to another in the short term. In the university, that's not always an easy thing to do. I think in the longer term, we are doing that. We're starting to do that. It will happen, but it's a process. And as you said in the report, this is a young system. It's still learning to be a system, and it sometimes takes a number of years to have a really functioning system. I think the report is very helpful in pointing out things that need to be done. But I also think there are parts here that are crucial that are really missing. So I want to say the same thing that Regent James said and Regent Yang said. The report is very helpful in one sense, but it's not complete. And I think, as Chancellor Chang tried to say, there are a lot of pieces here. And if we want consistency, there has to be a greater emphasis on consistency coming from the offices that deal with the university, the legislature, the executive branch of the government, et cetera, of the state government, et cetera. So thank you. But I think there are more pieces here that are in play.
Thank you, Regent Bloom. We're moving to Regent Wright, followed by President Maduko.
Okay, thank you, Pam. Thank you for the report. It was helpful. I'm not going to repeat some of what was said already by Regent James and Regent Bloom related to there's information in the report that's helpful, but there are more things that I'd like to know more about, but they were already expressed. But what I do want to mention, and I'm not sure that this can be answered today, but I think at some point, if this information or recommendations can come to the board. I've been on the board, probably the second longest person on this board. I've been on for 10 years. And there have always been talented people that make up the faculty, that make up the administration, and that make up the board. People who are very competent, have the best of intentions, and yet we're here where we are today. What I'd like to hear more of, and Regent James touched upon that, you talked a little bit about the need for having good project management. Anytime that you lead a large transformation, there's certain levels of competency and expertise and talent that you need. We've talked about some pieces of that, including the project management, but it would be helpful for me and I think for the other members of the board to learn more about what is the particular skill set that you need, whether it be in the system office, whether it be among the administration within the organization, but to understand, because again, I want to emphasize, it's not like we had a group of incompetent people who have been in these various positions. And I understand that there were recommendations that suggested that, rightfully so, that there needed to be better partnerships and coordination among the different groups, including the legislators, the faculty, the administrators, the students. There are a variety of people. But what is as you look at some of these other organizations that you compared us to that have done this well, what is the talent that was needed? What were the competencies that were needed? Did they do that helped them to navigate through through a transformation much better than what we have seen over the past many years?
So I really appreciate all these very good questions, and I'm not always equipped with super great answers because I'm not an expert on project management. But I do think that there are some characteristics that I think are worth noting. One is communication ability and style and regularity, putting a plan that's feasible together and involving the various different parties in doing that, in putting that plan in place and then sticking to it. I think that there are, that part of it, so like in Vermont, when they tried to recover from that payroll example that I mentioned, they hired a project manager out of the business world to sort of bring some of the discipline associated with that to the work that they were trying to do around the whole effort of integrating the institutions in that case. And it's been a bumpy road for them because it just is going to be. But I think that those are some strategies there. In Vermont, it was easier because the system was so much smaller. Here, it's going to require, I think, the broadening of a culture for understanding how the system will operate differently from institutions and work with the institutions to try to create the kind of change that's necessary. So I think that there's a set of, I think there's a discipline of project management, and I think that we don't have that discipline it's not in abundance in higher education, and so you might have to look a little elsewhere to bring somebody to help train the culture and the leadership around project management for a particular thing or two within the higher education system. I'm sure that there are others who could comment more in more detail on the specific sort of bullet items in a position description that might be necessary for that than me.
Thank you. President Maduco.
Hey, Brian, Dr. Jones, thank you for being here and obviously the work you put into this report. A couple of things. I've been in my role now 2.5 years, though it feels like 40 years. And what I've witnessed is the sheer fatigue on the part of our employees and our students. Like, that's been the common denominator in terms of whatever this is annual. Like, every year there's this guessing game on what level of funding will be provided or not, right? And I think that gets in the way of trying to fulfill the mission of our respective institutions to do the work, right? Because this is what we do. I drove from Boston earlier this morning to be here, and the people at the NetSheet conference, they know about the reveal of this report, and they're like, Connecticut, you guys are always just like in this space in terms of this dance, right? So I think it's really important to look through a human lens in terms of just the sheer toll this has had on the very people we serve. I think too, would love to hear your take on blended systems, because I think that's not often articulated enough in these type of discussions. CSCU is a 2-year, 4-year blended system, similar to CUNY, similar to SUNY, similar to Minnesota State, similar to Hawaii. And often when you speak to community college professionals, educators, administrators in those blended systems, what we all express is the frustration that there's always a skew or bias towards the 4 years. And I love my 4-year colleagues, but in terms of community college expertise, being involved in the ethos of planning and discussion, often it's at a lower level. I think too, I appreciate the work of AGB and the partnership that AGB is having with the System Office and the Board of Regents. But AGB is not the only national organization that can bring value to a blended system, right? We have the American Association of Community Colleges. That is the lobby for community colleges in the country, and we have the Association of Community College Trustees. I think often the insights of those community college specific thought leaders is absent from the discussion and the analysis, right? Our missions are different from universities, right? So just want to kind of hear your thoughts, because it makes it very difficult to do this work at all levels of CT State, when often I feel like there's a lack of just wisdom and knowledge from a community college perspective, right, woven into all levels of not only a system, but even the state government level. So just want to hear your take on that.
My take is that the systems that I've encountered that are blended, I would agree that the community colleges have regularly made the same argument that their needs and their appreciation for their very diverse mission is lost in conversations that focus on the 4-year bachelor's degree granting institutions. And in systems like Hawaii, the 4-year bachelor's degree granting institutions that aren't the flagship complain that it's all about the flagship. This is not necessarily an easy problem to solve, but I think that I for one think that it's a useful thing, and I'm happy to provide external sort of heft behind the statement that you just made, Dr. Maduco, that the regents need to have a clear appreciation for what's different about the challenges that are faced by Connecticut State than the challenges that are faced by each of the individual institutions that are, the CSUs and Charter Oak as well. As far as solving for that, I think that it's important to recognize that there are some things that the system office can do to ensure that attention is focused on the needs of the community college system, both the system office and the regents around that. in terms of how they build agendas, in terms of the way in which they allocate human resources to address those needs, including trying to create, some systems have identified an individual as a point of contact for workforce development activities that is not the exclusive province of community colleges, but helps to identify what are the assets of this entire system, many of which are going to be in the community colleges to address the needs of some employers in a particular place. And so I think that there's some value to be handled around that. And then there's a whole host of other things, but in bottom, I would not dispute the characterization you've made, which has been consistent in other settings where there's a blended system. I also don't have anything positive or negative to say about AGB, but your point is valid that there are others as well that are worth paying some attention to. And you might want to have a diversity of perspectives as board members from different sources of information about the role of systems and the role of community colleges in a blended system, et cetera, over the course of time as you think about that board development, board training, board evaluation activity.
Thank you. We're going to President Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian, for the report, and also thank you for explaining the enrollment cliff as basically an enrollment decline, and also the opportunities for dual enrollment. I recall when you visited Southern, we discussed the role of transfer enrollment and the growth of adult learners. So I think about when you examine innovative programs nationally in terms of augmenting the decline in traditional age enrollment, the focus is on non-traditional enrollment. Transfer enrollment is growing at CSCUs. I know for a fact that at Southern, more than 30% of our enrollment consists of transfers, but the majority figures coming from CT states. So my question is there a reason why there was not a focus or a recommendation on opportunities for enrollment growth, particularly creating a greater pipeline between CT state and four-year institutions? Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Smith. That's a good question. I do think that that one of the values of a system is to better ensure the mobility of student credits from the two-year institutions into the four-year institutions, and I certainly would commend efforts on the part of the CSUs to look to transfer student populations as a way to not just to meet their enrollment targets, but also just to serve the needs of student populations.
Thank you. Regent James?
Yes, I'd like to call on Dr. Louise Williams, the president of AAU. She sent us a comment, and Dr. Williams, if you are still with us, would love to give you the opportunity for your comment.
Oops, sorry. Okay, great. Now you can hear me. Thank you for allowing me to speak this morning. My comments are mostly for the board, not for NCHEMS. As you know, I'm Louise Williams. I'm president of CSU AAUP. Our union represents 3,000 teaching faculty, librarians, counselors, coaches, and athletic trainers at the 4 CSUs. CSU AAUP finds the NCHEM report both disturbing and problematic. A draft of our detailed response is including in your meeting info on your website, but I just want to mention a few concerns today. First, the NCHEM's report is a political document paid for by OPM to justify decisions they have already made. OPM already decided that the CSCU system does not deserve any more state funding and that it should shrink in size by cutting personnel and programs. OPM got what they paid for. That's exactly what the NCHEM's report concludes. For all its fancy graphs and data, the report does not answer some really important questions. How can the CSCU system contribute to a better future for all the people of Connecticut? How can it help our neighbors lead better lives? Help employers have access to thoughtful workers? Help expand the state's tax base? OPM does not care about those questions. CSU AAP's second concern is that the report provides a simplistic snapshot of the system's problem taken from a height of 30,000 feet. It ignores Connecticut's complex history, its politics, its economy, and it dismisses the lived experiences of students and faculty. The report quantifies enrollment decline but does not explain it. NCHEMS tells a story of a mismanaged system filled with overpaid personnel headed for catastrophe because of a prophecy of demographic disaster. CSU AUP has a different story. Ours is about economic reality. A decade-long recession with practically no increase in family income was combined with a state government unwilling to adequately fund higher education. The end result was a continual increase in tuition at a time when students were simply unable to afford it. Then COVID hit and made everything worse. This is the cause of the enrollment decline. CSU AUP sees a different future than NCHEMS, one with a happy ending, if the people in this room and at the Capitol have the political will to act. Our state has $4.1 billion in its rainy day fund, with positive predictions for surpluses in the next 3 years. We are well aware of the fiscal guardrails, but they can be altered and free up more than enough money to invest in higher education. CSU AAP has always struggled to be heard by this board. That's why we talk so much about shared governance. Chancellor Chang once told us that shared governance requires shared leadership. CSU AAP has provided that leadership in the defense of public higher education, and we will not back down. Last year, we worked very hard to get more money for the system. This year, we are working on a bill to extend the PACT program to the CSUs so students can afford a degree once more. The board has a decision to make. Will you join us in being real leaders of the system and help expand the opportunities that higher education provides, or will you throw up your hands and do the bidding of OPM? We have already made our decision. We will not stop fighting for our institutions, for our members, and for our students. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And we have one more president to hear from, President Singh.
Thank you. Thank you for the report, Brian. Very insightful, certainly. I do want to highlight to the community that is listening to this, because Western was topic being addressed here. The report pertains to up to 2022. Post 22, there have been significant changes. Specifically, board has been very supportive. System office has been very supportive in terms of collaboration, in terms of guidance, in terms of monitoring, even providing resources. And the results are clear. The community at Western has spoken up through their new strategic plan that just launched last month. So there is a cohesive, combined, united front that we know where we are going. And the results are clear because of the system's agility and responsiveness. We started new programs within record time. Artificial Intelligence Masters was the first one, Cybersecurity MBA one was another one. And kudos to all those faculty colleagues who came up with, within 6 months record time. I've been in this business for about 30 years. I've never seen within 8 months a new program being launched. And that's an example of how, even with shared governance, collaboration, faculty lead, BOR, and system office collaborating together, responding to the community's needs and emerging technologies and all that we know public education is supposed to be the public good. Your report, the previously that you reported for about 2 years back, that was a good catalyst for us to spring into action. Chancellor Chang has taken the lead. He has changed the leadership at Western. I have changed the leadership at Western. Entire CFOs, provost, and other VPs are new. Things are changing. We got the HSI status because we are very responsive to the emerging demographic trends there. System office has led very ably the dual enrollment and transfer policies and the collaboration we are having with City State, with Southern, with Central. In fact, informal and formal, there is collaboration that's going across sister institutions. I just wanted to make it a point that given the new strategic plan, given new programs, given the collaborative nature of what Western stakeholders have done till now, we have made some very significant progress. We have to look at three things for future. Let's make sure that we understand that equity is our guiding North Star, especially in my community where I lead this institution. Post-COVID, equity has been actually suffering. Health, physical, financial, mental health especially. Now, second thing I want to highlight is that financial prudence is the biggest one here because we cannot deliver on the public good mission unless we have lights on and financially prudent. Point is well taken. We have made some strides in there as well. 62% budget reduction, deficit reduction from 12 million to 4.7 million is significant. And it is cumulative over the next year and the next year. It's easy in the corporate world to make change by destroying things. When you're talking about higher education institutions, especially in the Western Connecticut state region, I am very proud of the system and the BOR and the faculty colleagues and staff colleagues at Western that without destroying, we have rebound, and I see a resurgence. Thank you for your report, your data, and your recommendations. I think we have a positive trajectory that we must look at. And thank you all for supporting Western in this moment. And we promise that every one of my colleagues, every one of my students, every one of our larger community deserves the best, and I hope that you all join us together in making sure that the mission is to prepare tomorrow for nation building, and that's a noble cause. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, President Singh. I believe Charlene Casamento has comments.
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today, asking great questions, taking the opportunity to review the report for all that it offers. As I noted in the beginning, there's a lot here to digest. There's a lot of different perspectives about the recommendations. And no offense to NCHEMS, but this is a third party's recommendations. Really the job for CSU and the state is to really look at these recommendations, think about how they can improve our higher education system. There's, as Brian points out, there's no silver bullet, right? We can't steal the plan from someone else. And I certainly look forward to the dialogue that hopefully will occur over the coming weeks and months. This is a journey. It's not a sprint. For sure. So thank you all. I really appreciate all of the perspectives and the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Chancellor Chang.
Thank you. So we're running long on this meeting. I'm going to try to be brief, but again, I just want to just say thanks to President Singh real quick because Western folks have embraced this challenge, right? The system office, this administration has embraced the challenge. Western has embraced the challenge. We have a lot of really talented people at Western, at CT State, and across this entire system, every institution, every campus. And every single one of us, regardless of which angle or perspectives we might come from, we want the best for our students. We want the best for our institutions, our communities. Every single board member here who has, whether you've served for a year or whether you've served for over 10 years, folks want what is best for this system. And I really do also want to thank Dr. Williams, our AUP colleagues and leaders, and also our faculty senates, our student governments. I've had a lot of meetings recently with our faculty senates, leadership and full senates, our student government leaders, and our collective bargaining leaders. Again, I can't be more proud of their passion, their commitment. There are many wounds that need to heal for this system. If we disregard that, if we don't recognize the genuine pain that folks have experienced and endured at certain points during this journey, then we are doing a disservice to them, right? At the same time, we must also focus on how to make things better now and into the future. So learning from the lessons of the past, trying to salve those wounds, and then becoming stronger and healthier every day to make progress. And I really do believe that that's what we are all here for. We're not going to agree every step of the way. We are going to continue to have some bumps in the road, but I have incredible faith in everybody, and I will be not just behind people, I'll be with you, I'll be for you, I'll be shoulder to shoulder. And folks know that I like to roll up the sleeves and get in the weeds as much as the team tries to keep me out of the weeds. I love the weeds. I just love being in the mix, and I love being in the fight. If this is not a fight worth engaging in, then I don't know what is, and I know we're all here for that. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Cheng. And I turn to Vice Chair Juanita James.
Thank you very much, Pam. Unfortunately, Chair Gray had to leave the meeting for another commitment, so I will close out the meeting by echoing everyone's thanks for participation, interest. We have a lot of work to do, and I definitely appreciate the amount of time, effort, and attention we all put into solving the problems and creating the future. I also think that we can do this work together. We may disagree, but it's very important for us to respect each other's intentions and motives, and to appreciate the work that everyone is trying to do to make us better. Brian, thank you so much for the amount of time and attention you've put into this. I'm sure there is much more work going forward as we digest not only this report, but the response from AAUP and more input from our faculty, our Senate, and our administrators as we move forward. With that, I would like to call for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you so much.
We are adjourned. If you would stop the live stream, please.